will he find us when he comes?
Awake and ready.
And when he asks us to dedicate ourselves more perfectly, how will he find us?
Awake and ready.
Let's pray together. I just have to say, I had a vision then of Master running out onto the stage, air flying behind him. Heavenly Father,
Heavenly Father,
Divine Mother,
Divine Mother,
friend, beloved God,
friend, beloved God,
Jesus Christ,
Jesus Christ,
Bhagaji Krishna,
Bhagaji Krishna,
Lahiri Mahashaya,
Lahiri Mahashaya,
Swami Sri Yukteswar,
Swami Shri Yukteswar,
beloved Master,
beloved Master,
Paramahansa Yogananda,
Paramahansa Yogananda,
saints of all religions,
saints of all religions,
humbly we bow before you.
humbly we bow before you.
Help us to feel your presence
Help us to feel your
in
presence
this service this morning.
in this service this morning.
Help us to try our best
Help us to try our best
to stay connected with that presence
to stay connected with that presence
throughout the rest of this day,
throughout the rest of this day,
this coming week,
this coming week,
and all of our lives.
and all of our lives.
Divine Mother,
Divine Mother,
we are your little children.
we are your little children.
Wrap your arms around us,
Wrap your arms
that
around
we may feel your love.
that we may feel your love.
Oh,
Oh,
peace.
peace.
Amen.
Amen.
Be seated. Have some music.
Once there lived a tiny nightingale in the ancient land of Israel. Not a note he ever sang until that night when Christ was born. That night, no song he could sing, so wise men tell, till that night when Christ was born. That night he came upon a field, there a band of shepherds who sleep in view. For none knew what wonders the dark concealed that night when Christ was born. That night, no song you could sing, so wise men tell, till that night when Christ was born. Suddenly an angel host appeared with their songs, the solemn darkness cleared. And the shepherds awoke as those revealed that night when Christ was born. That night, no song he did sing, so wise men tell, till that night when Christ was born. Then the nightingale did fly up high till he joined the angels in the sky. In his joy he opened his beak to cry that night when Christ was born. That night, no song he could sing, so wise men tell, till that night when Christ was born. As he tried to chirp that holy name, suddenly his voice in music came, and with him that they to our hearts once more may bring that night when Christ was born. That night, no song we can sing, so wise men tell till that night when Christ is born. That night, no song we can sing, so wise men tell till that night when Christ is born.
Remaining in a state of meditation. Let's listen to these words on practicality. Many spiritual seekers and others with high ideals lose sight of the need to make their idealism practical. Many even resent the suggestion that they try to put an ideal into practice, as though the very effort to do so would mean somehow lessening its purity. But God is no idle dreamer. Were the universe not kept in a state of perfect balance, chaos, not harmony, would be the common state. Life, to be ever expansive, must be a search for truth. Will it work, is the preliminary question to, is it true? The test of an ideal is whether it is practical or not. By practicality, we mature from the state of idle dreaming to becoming emissaries of the truth. Let's affirm together. Though my spirit soars in the skies of consciousness,
Though my spirit soars in the skies of consciousness,
my feet and hands labor here on earth
my feet and hands labor here on earth
to make truth real to all.
to make truth real to all.
Though my spirit soars in the skies of consciousness,
Though my spirit soars in the skies of consciousness,
my feet and hands labor here on earth
my feet and hands labor here on earth
to make truth real to all.
to make truth real to all.
Now a little more softly, taking it more inward. Though my spirit soars in the skies of consciousness,
Though my spirit soars in the skies of consciousness,
my feet and hands labor here on earth
my feet and hands labor here on earth
to make truth real to all.
to make truth real to all.
And now as a whisper, though my spirit soars in skies of consciousness, my feet and hands labor here on earth to make truth real to all. And now mentally, taking it deep within, lift your gaze to the spiritual eye and affirm. Though my spirit soars in the skies of consciousness, my feet and hands labor here on earth to make truth real to all. Now pray mentally with me. Let not my thoughts lift me up through beautiful clouds of imagined possibilities, unless you, Lord, give me the power also to materialize my dreams. Om Shanti. Amen. This is a reading from Rays of the One Light, weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Ananda. This week's title is Living in the Presence of God. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 25, we read of a king, capitalized for the reference is to God, who welcomes certain devotees to the divine consciousness, saying, I was hungry, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. The elect asked him when it was that they had served him in these ways, and the king answered, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you have done it for one of the least of these, you have done it for me. To see God residing in every human being, as indeed he does, is to open oneself to limitless opportunities for serving him. Paramahansa Yogananda, in Autobiography of a Yogi, described a saint who lived in this consciousness as the greatest man of humility I ever knew. He described a seemingly chance encounter with this saint. Another day found me walking alone near the Howrah railroad station. I stood for a moment by a temple, silently criticizing a small group of men with drum and cymbals who were violently reciting a chant. How undevotionally they used the Lord's divine name in mechanical repetition, I reflected. My gaze was astonished by the rapid approach of Master Mahashaya. Sir, how come you here? The saint, ignoring my question, answered my thought. Isn't it true, little sir, that the beloved's name sounds sweet from all lips, whether ignorant or wise? He passed his arm around me affectionately, and I found myself carried on his magic carpet to the merciful presence. If you would see God, watch for him everywhere. If you would hear his voice, listen for it in all sounds, and also in their supporting silences. If you would know God, seek his wisdom behind merely human knowledge. The Bhagavad Gita in the 6th chapter states, One who beholds my presence everywhere, and all things dwelling equally in me, he never loses loving sight of me, nor I of him, through all eternity. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to you all. Welcome to anyone out there who's looking at live streaming, and all those people who I'll be talking to after December 15th. Welcome to you as well. This is Prayer at Dawn. With the opening of the earliest dawn and the lotus buds, my soul softly opens in prayer to receive thy light. Bathe each petal of my mind with thy radiant rays. I saturate myself with the perfume of thy presence, and I wait to waft with the breeze the aroma of thy message of love to all. Bless me, that with the spreading dawn I may spread thy love everywhere. Bless me, that with the awakening dawn I may awaken all souls with my own and bring them to thee. So Master exhorts us to pray at dawn, and in the very next whisper, to pray at noon, and in the very next whisper, to pray in the evening, and in the very next whisper, pray at night. You would get the feeling that he's trying to help us pray quite a lot, maybe even most of the time. Or today we're going to look at praying the time, talking with God, listening to God, living the presence of God, practicing the presence of God. In 1930, in a remote area of the Philippines, in one of the southern islands there, was an area that was a Muslim stronghold. And there was an American missionary who at this time was quite frustrated because his attempts to integrate himself more into the indigenous Moro community there were failing. Some of the Filipino Christian teachers who had come to that area before had violated some of the local customs, and several of them had been killed, and more than 50 of their schools had been burned down. But this missionary, Frank Laubach, encountered hostility and indifference everywhere that he went. All of the areas that he had been called to serve in rebuffed him. And then in addition to this threatening situation was the very great challenge that this group of Moros had no written language. And Laubach considered it absolutely essential, if he were to bring new concept and new ideas to a people, that they had to be able to read. They had to be able to understand in more depth, contemplate the things that he wanted to teach them. But after a time, he had to acknowledge that he was making absolutely no progress. And Laubach was not only discouraged at his inability to win over the Moro then, but he was also discouraged about his own spiritual progress, his own spiritual life. About 2 years prior to this moment, Laubach had found himself very dissatisfied as he realized that he had been a Christian missionary or minister for 15 years, and still he was not able to live every day in the presence of God, in a minute-to-minute effort to converse with God and to follow God's will. Or as St. Paul said in the New Testament, to pray without ceasing. He had been determined for a long time to have that kind of spiritual life. When he'd been in high school, he had read The Imitation of Christ by Thomas Kempis. And then when he was in college, he found Practicing the Presence by Brother Lawrence. And both of them threw out this idea that you could be in divine contact every waking moment. Well, there, amidst his dilemma with the Moros, he renewed his spiritual efforts. He began again to try to attune himself to the divine presence. And he was committed to realign his will with God's will every few minutes. That every few minutes he would check in again and see if he was following the divine pattern that God had laid out for him. What, Father, do you desire said? What, Father, do you desire done? Exactly how and what do you want done this minute? And he felt he was making a little progress. But in Frank's view, this was exactly how Jesus had lived his life, completely embraced and surrendered to the divine, embracing God and surrendered to the divine will. Each evening during this period at sunset, he would climb this little hill, this little mountain, kind of called Signal Hill. It took him about 20 minutes to get the base of it, and then he would go up. And once he climbed up, he could overlook lakes and mountains, and in the distance, he could see the sea, always trying to keep his mind on God, always staying open to receiving God's response. And sometimes, since he was alone, he would talk to God out loud. and go along. You know, these days that's not so odd because people have their earbuds in. But it used to be that if you saw somebody walking along talking out loud, you thought something was wrong. At any rate, he was alone usually when he was out there at night climbing up Signal Hill. And so he would talk to God aloud, listening with all his soul for an answer, both to his missionary conundrum and also to his spiritual challenges. Though he was improving his practice of conversing with God and increasingly felt God's presence, he still could not help but get discouraged sometimes. And one such evening, God spoke to him out on Signal Hill. He spoke to him through Frank Laubach's own voice. And all of a sudden he heard himself say, "My child, you have failed because you do not really love these Moros. You feel superior to them. If you can forget you are an American, forget you are white, forget who you are, and think only of how much I love them, they will respond." Well, Laubach answered back, "It is the truth, God. Please drive me out of myself. Come and take possession of me and think thy thoughts in my mind. Make thy will my will." And then the voice answered again in his own voice, saying through his own lips, "If you want the Moros to be fair to your religion, then you must be fair to theirs. Study the Quran with them." This instruction was quite a surprise for a Congregationalist minister that his whole adult life had been focused on trying to win people to the Bible and to Christ. So the next day, Laubach went to the Moro priests and told them that he wanted to study the Quran with them. And they responded very eagerly, hoping that he was going to become a convert. The next day, when they met, the priest brought a list of 4 books that he was to study. The first was the Torah, the laws of Moses. The second, the Zabur, the Psalms of David. And the third, I don't know for sure how to pronounce this, Kitab Injil, was the Gospel of Jesus Christ. And the fourth was the Quran, the 4 holy books of Islam. And Laubach explained to them as well as he could, with what he had learned thus far of their language, that from childhood he had always studied the first 3 of their books. And now he would begin to focus on his study of the 4th. Well, this opened the door to his ministry with them. And as a result, he was able to really focus on illiteracy, which he felt was essential. He had to do that first before he could really talk to them about religion. He was able to create a written form of their local language and compile a dictionary, soon a printing press, and then a school followed. And this whole program was the forerunner of Frank Laubach's in the past at least, very famous program called Each One, Teach One. And through that program, over 100 million people learned to read, became literate in over 300 different countries. It was a very major endeavor in the middle part of the last century. Well, in time, those Moro priests and a group of young Moros expressed their gratitude to him. "You are the first one who ever tried to appreciate and understand us," they would tell him repeatedly. As he continued to develop his way of being in constant contact with God, he found that the divine now seemed to be cooperating with him, not only in his spiritual development, but in everything, in the secular parts of his life and in his work. That was especially true with his relations with the Moros. because the Moros could observe the change in him. And seeing that difference, they took him into their hearts and into their lives, loving and trusting him and helping him and his work without regard to their cultural and religious differences. Laubach wrote at this time, "Now I'm finding that I like God's presence so much that when he slips out of my mind, and he still does many times a day, I feel as though I've deserted him and I've lost something so precious out of my life." His primary aims had always really been spiritual, to live his life in a moment-to-moment relationship with God, and to inspire others to do the same. So during these first 2 years he spent with the Moros, he decided that he was just going to revolutionize his spiritual life. And Laubach seemed to understand the necessity of learning how, of method, of technique. And he was a very subtle and realistic experimenter. Thus, in the beginning of his new commitment, he would experiment for several days doing one thing or another. In the beginning, he would try to give just even a second, 1 or 2 seconds from every hour to God, and think of him at least that long, but every hour. You know, this idea of technique and focus on technique, it's not something most Christians do. That sounds like yoga. You know, we try to develop the techniques that deepen us, but he was very attuned to this and experimented to see what would work best. He was doing this a few seconds or sometimes minutes every hour, but he said he still felt like he was not led. He called himself unled. And so then he experimented by trying to see God's presence in every movement that he would make with his body. So moving his hand, moving his foot, willing, he wrote, willing that he shall direct these fingers even as they now type the typewriter, when he was writing that sentence, willing that he would pour through my steps even as I walk. But he wanted to go even further. He wanted to compel his mind to open straight out to God. But he found to get himself in a place where he felt he could have this direct connection with God took him a long time. So he would get up at 3 or 4 in the morning. I mean, he would awake at 3 or 4 in the morning, and he would stay in bed until he had that connection with the divine. And then we would get up and start his work. Sounds suspiciously like things we know about, doesn't it? Get up early, go and have that time with God until we feel connected. As he did this, he found that over time it was getting easier and easier to maintain that connection with God. And he was praying that eventually it would become a habit and not take quite so much of his energy and his effort to do it all the time. At one point, reflecting on the results of 2 months of strenuous effort to keep his mind on God, this time it was every minute, at least a second in every minute, he exclaimed, "This concentration upon God is strenuous, but most other things in my life have ceased to be." So as he would keep that commitment and that focus, the other parts of his life began to become more harmonious and took less effort. He felt that he was getting the cooperation from God in even the little things more than he had ever felt. He said, "I need something," and I turn around, and there it is waiting for me. God is working along with me. Well, he thought that surely there would be periods when a person could not have that connection with God. And he had kind of accepted that through much of his development. But in time, he came to feel that he would eventually be able to do it
100% of the time. One of his phrases was, "Any hour for anybody can be rich with God." So the inner changes that took place in him were substantial and had real outward effects. He wrote at one point, "God does work a change. The moment I turn to him, it is like turning on an electric current that I feel through my whole body. There is a real presence." And he found that presence in him affected the other people that he worked with and that he tried to serve as well. And similar to the mystics of all the ages, we'll find him at one point crying out, "Oh God, I scarce can see how one could live if his heart held more joy than mine has had from thee these past 2 hours." He called his God-reminding, God-awareness method the game of minutes. And he wrote a little booklet by that title that has sold over 4 million copies. It was designed to show others how to practice the presence of God. And many years later, in the early 1950s, at the age of 70, Laubach had a vision of God and Jesus together in a long room. And Jesus spoke to him, saying that it was time for him to take a long stride toward becoming a full-grown son of God. And he showed him how to deepen his attunement by minute focus deeply at the point between the eyebrows. This is what Jesus said to Frank Laubach. And Jesus explained, "Your game with the minutes was in the right direction. But tonight you're going beyond that game into the game of moments." And he pointed out a hymn that Frank liked and quoted this from the hymn. Jesus quoted to Frank, "Moment by moment I'm lost in his love. Moment by moment I've power from above." So this is what Frank was beginning to experience more. The more lost he could be, the more he had the power to make things work on earth. And Jesus told him that from then on, Laubach was to spend day and night with the door wide open to this same secret interview room. And Jesus explained that the interview room was in the front of your head. When you wish to consult the Father and I, just lift your eyes up a little, and there we are. Not beyond the stars, but just over your eyes. So in today's reading, Swamiji points out that we have the opportunity to become transformed ourselves, so we are able to serve the divine through the endless opportunities that surround us every day. So we can see that by going more deeply inward and having that continuous connection with the divine, we are able to serve even better those that are all around us. We can prepare ourselves for this by making our relationship with the divine one of constant conversation and constant cooperation.